For almost 4 decades, The Legend of Zelda has consistently been one of the most beloved franchises in all of gaming, and for good reason. It sets the standards for what the entire medium seeks to achieve. Expansive worlds, tight gameplay, puzzling dungeons, engaging narratives, charming characters, stunning visuals, soul-lifting music. All of it can be found here. Not only are these games generally amazing and have influenced so many other games and franchises, but they're a core part of my identity and how I view video games as an artistic medium. It's easily my favorite franchise in gaming, and maybe even in general. I've spent the past few years going through every game in the franchise to eventually rank them all. And now looks like a great time since Tears of the Kingdom finally released and we've all had plenty of time to breathe it in. Now that the dramatic intro is over with, I think it's time I go over the restrictions. As you can probably expect, I'm only ranking the mainline entries in the series. That means we'll be skipping Warriors, Cadence of Hyrule, YouTube Poops, and Shovelware. Also, as a first for any video game franchise ranking I made, remakes will not be ranked separately from the originals. Honestly, this is mainly due to me being too broke to afford the Link's Awakening remake, and even then, I feel like my opinion on it wouldn't be too different from the original. That also means remasters won't be ranked separately either, but that should go without saying. With all that out of the way, it's time to finally find out which legend is the most legendary, starting with the one that started it all. Before you yell at me for putting a classic at the bottom, I just want to make it clear that every game on the list is decent, at the bare minimum. I like every game in the series to at least some extent. The Legend of Zelda on NES is far from a bad game. It's more so just archaic and outdated. Pretty much everything it does, no matter how well, is just done way better in later installments. That's not to say it does a lot of things badly. Hell, it actually does a few things pretty well. Though the overworld is very simplistic, it's still pretty fun to roam around and kill things. Since there isn't really a set path you could take, you can explore the world at your own pace, fulfilling tasks as you see fit. I can see how a lot of kids back in the 80s would have a lot of fun roaming around the world while they read the manual and drew their own maps to help them. But we're not in the 80s anymore, and this style of investment in the game doesn't really hold up. In the age of the internet, it's much easier to just look up a pre-made map or guide online to get where you need to go. That might actually be the optimal way to play, considering how hidden some secrets are, some of which are required to beat the game. Also, as much as I do enjoy exploring the overworld, I can't really say the same for the dungeons. Gonna be honest with y'all, I really don't like the dungeons in Zelda 1. The first few are fine, I guess, but the rest are full of repetitive rooms, overly complex routes, and annoying enemies that kick your ass at every turn. The clunky controls do not help. You can't move diagonally, and your sword can only stab forward, making it pretty annoying to deal with enemies. But at the end of the day, it's still the original Legend of Zelda. The series would not exist without it, as it laid the foundations for all future installments to follow. Sure, this game's foundations weren't exactly great, but later games still tweaked and improved the formula, molding it into the one we all know and love today. Zelda 1 is only really at the bottom because you pretty much need a guide to enjoy it, and everything it does is just done better in later games. But when the worst game in your series is the first one purely due to being outdated, yet it still manages to be a decent time, that's a sign you made a damn good series. I'm kind of gonna have to cheat with this next one. The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords was a side game bundled with the GBA port of A Link to the Past. Unlike the other multiplayer-driven entries in the series, which allow you to play alone, 4 Swords requires you to play with at least one friend. While I was able to set up my emulator for multiplayer, I quickly realized that I have no nearby friends who'd be willing to play a niche puzzle game from the early 2000s with me. Yeah, I know the Anniversary Edition on DSi lets you play alone, but it was only sold for a limited time, and I just wasn't able to emulate it, no matter what ROM I used or what box I ticked. Thankfully, my sister was able to join me for the first half hour or so of the game, and from what we played, it was fine. From what I can gather, it's a fairly standard multiplayer ordeal that really forces players to put aside their differences. You and your friends must make your way through a random order of stages in a chosen area, collecting rupees as you go. Find enough rupees and you can proceed to the boss, and by extension, the end of that area. All players need to work together to defeat the bosses, and since this is where my sister decided to jump ship, I was not able to proceed, and I sure as hell am not using her just for more of this game. I don't really know what else to say about 4 Swords. I don't know if it should even be on this list since I didn't make it past the first world. However, I still feel like I got a good enough impression of the full experience from what I played of it. It's fine, but nothing special. Yo, it's Linebeck, the sexiest man in the world! Okay, aside from having the second most based character in the franchise, I kind of don't really care for Phantom Hourglass. It's not a bad game, as I still ranked it above 2 games I consider passable, but in such a rich series, this game feels so shallow. For one, it released in the middle of the DS's life, so you know what that means. Force DS gamers! All the basic controls in this game, like moving, fighting, and using items, require the touchscreen. It isn't necessarily unplayable, but it's quite clunky and takes some getting used to. There are also a few points where you're required to yell into the microphone, which can be pretty disruptive if you're playing this game out in the open. Not every DS gimmick this game shoves down your throat is bad, however. This game lets you write down memos with the touchscreen, which is a godsend for memorizing details and solving puzzles. Sure, you could write down notes about the games on real paper before, but it's nice to see it get encouraged in-game. The ocean in this game is pretty bare bones. There are some decent goodies here and there, but there's barely anything to do beyond sailing to the next island. The islands you explore are fine. They're nothing amazing, but they serve as decent enough build up to the dungeons. The dungeons themselves, with one exception, are honestly pretty solid. They're full of creative puzzles, and they make great use of this game's mechanics. I especially love how the boomerang works in this game. You can draw a whole route for it, vastly increasing its utility. As I said, however, there is one indescribably awful dungeon in this game, which is the Temple of the Ocean King. This is unanimously agreed upon to be the worst dungeon in the series, and for good reason. In this dungeon, you're forced to work with a strict time limit. This can cause anxiety, which reduces your ability to think, which is kind of important when you're in a Zelda dungeon. It doesn't help that it also features stealth, invincible enemies that can one-shot you, boring and or confusing puzzles that reset when you leave, and worst of all, you have to go here 5 times throughout the game. You have to go through the same rooms doing the same puzzles and stealth over and over again. As you can imagine, this is a nauseating experience that drags the rest of the game down with it. Also, presentation-wise, this game does not impress. Going from the gorgeous pixel art of the GBA to the dull, blocky polygons of the DS is such a downgrade. And I really hate to say this about a Zelda game, but the music is really forgettable. Aside from remixes from past games and Linebeck's theme, the soundtrack sounds so lifeless and flat. Every single dungeon uses the exact same 20-second loop with very static notes. Even Zelda 1 had more variety in its dungeon themes. While I can't really bring myself to rank it dead last, Phantom Hourglass might be my personal least favorite Zelda game, and I forget more of it with each passing day. It's still a relatively okay game, but I don't plan on coming back to it, especially when Wind Waker and Spirit Tracks exist. Triforce Heroes. Bet you forgot this game existed. This game released during that awkward period within the 2 years leading up to the Switch's release, when Nintendo didn't have a lot of heavy hitters to fill in the gaps, so they had to pump out a ton of awful games. Unlike most of those games, however, Triforce Heroes is actually fine. This game is built around multiplayer, so if you want to get the most out of this game, you'll need a couple of friends who also own 3DSs and copies of this game. Thankfully, you're still allowed to play alone. In single player, you switch between each link akin to Penguins of Madagascar on the DS. It sometimes works well, but in certain tight puzzles, battles, and especially bosses, it can get pretty clunky and frustrating. I don't think this game was designed with single player in mind at all. It's a shame too, because the levels are genuinely well designed, and from what I've seen of the Runaway Guys Let's Play, they flow really well in multiplayer. Thanks to the 3D graphics of the 3DS, this game plays a lot more with verticality than Four Swords and Adventures. Players can pick up, carry, and throw each other, which serves as the basis for a lot of puzzles in this game. Also, running on a Link Between Worlds engine, this game controls really well. Aside from the multiplayer, this game's other big selling point is the costumes, and I don't really like them. I mean, they look nice, they offer some nice abilities, and they're mostly optional, but if you want them, you have to replay specific levels without dying and pray that you pick the right chest at the end to get the right material. And in single player, only the green Link can wear costumes while the other two are stuck with the hero tunic. I found this to be really annoying, and the only costume I put together was the legendary dress, just so I would finally have an excuse to call Link Zelda. Also, I honestly really like the fact that this game has such a silly premise. It's like Nintendo was aware this is going to be a throwaway game and just went with whatever they could pull out of the hat, just to give this game some wacky flair. Don't know what else to say about Triforce Heroes. It's just okay, which means by late 2015 Nintendo standards, it is top tier!
Oh, I got dead again!
Zelda 2 is a stupid, terrible, unfair, BS, tedious, repetitive, overly difficult, outdated piece of shit. But I kinda love it. Look, I get it. An infamously difficult game from the NES era sounds like the exact kind of game I would despise. After all, an example of that ranked dead last in the Mario ranking. Even then, I can't really bring myself to hate Zelda 2. Maybe it's because I played it on Switch Online, which has a rewind function, but I digress. Rather than a pure adventure game like most of the series, Zelda 2 is kind of a side-scrolling RPG. The top-down overworld functions more like that of a Final Fantasy game, with how entering a town, battle, or palace sends you to a different screen. Also, just like any regular RPG, killing enemies grants experience points, which is the main method of getting stronger in this game. Given how difficult this game is, getting stronger by leveling up, training with the sword, and learning spells is really satisfying. You're not just getting more stuff, you're getting stronger. Also, for a cheaply difficult NES game, the controls are actually pretty solid. The hitboxes can be a little janky, but the movement is smooth enough, and landing hits is satisfying. The sprite work is leaps and bounds better than the original, and the soundtrack is also really catchy and underrated. If there's anything about this game I can't defend, it's the difficulty. This game is a f***ing asshole to the player a lot of the time. There are so many cryptic and confusing paths that you need to take to finish the game, and don't even get me started on how annoying some enemies and bosses can be to fight. How anyone would be able to do this on an NES without access to an online guide is beyond me. This really should make me hate this game, but as I've stated before, I just can't. To me, Zelda 2 feels like a weird relic of a bygone era where so many games were fiendishly difficult, and I can't help but love it for that. Adventure of Link may be extremely unfair and poorly designed, but its bizarre existence just puts a big smile on my face. But since I need to keep my true Zelda fan status, I have to admit that there are much better options for quality games than this.
Winter, spring, summer, or fall.
On the Game Boy Color, there was a set of two similar Zelda games built on Link's Awakening's engine that released simultaneously, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Seasons was the one I chose to play first, and in my opinion, it's the lesser of the two. Compared to Ages, Seasons is a lot more combat focused. Many rooms within the dungeons consist of large waves of enemies, and there's a wide variety of enemies and bosses. That's not to say it's completely action focused, as in true Zelda fashion, there's quite a few puzzles, and they're kind of hit or miss in this game. The main hook of this game is the changing seasons. By getting on a stump and casting the Rod of Seasons, you can switch the season of the area you're in, affecting the terrain by freezing water or allowing certain plants to grow. It works a lot like Floria from Kirby Superstar or Click Clock Wood from Banjo-Kazooie. It's a simple gimmick, but it works wonders for this game's overworld, and the environments look really vibrant and colorful in each season. This is honestly one of the best looking games in the Game Boy Color for that reason. The dungeons and overworld also have some solid puzzles involving various items, such as the new magnetic gloves, which allow you to push and pull objects and yourself. Basically, they're the first draft of Magnesis from Breath of the Wild. However, the dungeons occasionally have some really confusing puzzles that can be quite annoying to solve. Also, you have to go to an underworld called Subroja several times to power up the rod to conjure more seasons, and it can be pretty annoying and tedious to go through. Back on the plus side, you get 3 animal buddies to help you out in your journey, and they're all pretty fun, even if you can only keep one of them for the rest of your adventure. And for those of you wondering, I went with Moosh. Also, when you finally defeat the clansman Onox, saved in, and beat the game, you'll receive a code, which you can use to link your save file for this game up with Oracle of Ages, unlocking some extra stuff in that game. Same goes true for playing Ages first and linking up with Seasons. I would elaborate on the details, but I think I'll save it for when I talk about Ages, as that's the one I played second. Anyway, while it is the weaker of the two Oracle games thanks to a few annoying or confusing moments, Seasons is still a very fun game that I recommend playing. Whether or not you should play this before Ages is up to you. Just pick the one that suits you.
Master Link, did you know that you are low on hearts?
Yeah, I heard that beeping.
At long last, after 6 out of 20 entries, we have come to our first 3D entry in the ranking, which is of course the heavily divisive Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. This is the one 3D Zelda that isn't really seen as anything special by many. The people who hate this game really hate it, and even those who love it have a few issues with it. As someone on the positive side of this game's reception, I have a few problems with it too, so let's get them out of the way first. To start, the handholding is pretty excessive. I know that Zelda games can be a bit annoying to beat without looking up walkthroughs, but that doesn't mean I need Fi to point in the direction I need to head in every step of the way. While the areas are fun to traverse, you have to go back through these areas you've already done for some usually contrived reason multiple times to advance the story. Also, holy hell do I hate the imprisoned fights. The third fight in particular might just be the single worst boss in the entire series. Also, I played the original Wii version for this ranking, so I had to put up with unskippable cutscenes, Fi's constant yapping, and having to learn about items I already have 68 of. I know the Switch version fixed a few of these issues, but come on. I know I've made it sound like this game shouldn't rank this high, but trust me, there's a lot more to this game than its detractors tell you. While the opening on Skyloft is admittedly a little too long, it does a great job at setting up the journey ahead. Zelda herself has almost always been the series' major damsel in distress, but you've never really been given a reason to care about her beyond she's the princess. In Skyward Sword, not only is she a commoner, but you spend a lot of time with her at the start, which greatly fleshes her out. She has a great dynamic with Link and various other characters, which makes the oncoming journey all the more engaging and impactful. And what a journey it is. The areas are noticeably more compact and linear, but that doesn't make them bad in the slightest. The journeys to each dungeon almost feel like dungeons of their own, with how many mostly engaging situations you must go through, especially in the Lanayru Desert. Seriously, whoever came up with shifting certain areas back in time as a mechanic deserves a raise. It helps that the dungeons themselves are stellar. Sure, the first two are kinda generic, but the other 5 are fantastic, especially the Ancient Cistern, which is straight up one of the best dungeons in the entire series. Now let's talk about the main thing people despise about this game, the motion controls. While they have occasionally gotten on my nerves, particularly with the Loftwing, I honestly don't mind them. If anything, they help keep me engaged with the combat since I need to think before I swing so I can land a hit on an enemy. The controls also greatly complement this game's various items, such as the whip, the gust bellows, and especially the beetle. Overall, Skyward Sword, despite being riddled with backtracking, hand-holding, and various quality of life issues, is a great time thanks to its engaging combat, its intricate level design, and its brilliant characterization. If a game this good is by far the weakest 3D Zelda, that should make it clear that we have some absolute masterpieces coming up. You know, I feel like I forgot something in this entry. What could it be? Oh yeah, Bruce, the most based character in the franchise! He starts out as a neighborhood bully who attempts to hijack your role as a hero, only for him to find out that he has no place in the story. But he accepts this and still helps you on your quest to save Zelda in whatever way he can. That, right there, is the most legendary character arc in history. Zuko and Violet could never. He's charismatic, he's hilarious, he has the best character theme known to man, but most importantly, he is Groot!
Tim!
The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures is the worst-selling mainline entry in the franchise. Here's why. It's a multiplayer-focused 2D game for the GameCube. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? Well, the multiplayer, the core focus of the game, required each player to have their own Game Boy Advance and link cable. As you can imagine, this was an expensive pain in the ass that almost nobody could afford, and thus this game was swept under the radar. Here's the thing. Unlike its GBA predecessor, 4 Swords Adventures is playable alone, and not only that, but it's still really fun with just one player. Rather than running around randomly selected levels scavenging for rupees, Adventures has you simply running through semi-linear levels while still gathering collectibles, in this case, Force Gems. This game feels more in line with something like Super Mario 3D World than your typical top-down Zelda, though it still has the series' staple puzzle and combat elements. Even though most of the levels are essentially get from point A to point B, they still require some clever thinking to pass through. When you enter certain sub-areas in this game, you show up on the screen of your GBA, which adds an extra layer of complexity to this game's design. Not that it justifies the need to buy 4 GBAs, but it's still such a cool detail. Not to mention, there are quite a few levels that feel like they could be their own scenarios in a more traditional Zelda game. A great example is World 2's Village of the Blue Maiden, in which you have to navigate between the overworld on the TV and the dark world on the GBA to reunite the village. It's one of many levels that use this game's mechanics to their fullest, alongside the likes of Lost Woods, Infiltration of Hyrule Castle, and various final levels and worlds, which all feel like proper Zelda dungeons. While it does suck that you need to pay a fortune to get the full experience out of this game, 4 Swords Adventures is still a very fun and underrated entry in the franchise. If we could get a port of this game to the Switch or its incoming successor that doesn't force you to buy multiple systems for multiplayer, that would be great.
It's time to stop!
Oracle of Ages was the second of the Oracle duology that I played, and as you can already tell, my preferred game of the two. This game's main hook is the ability to switch between the past and the present of Labrynna, akin to the Light and Dark worlds in A Link to the Past. Honestly, I feel like Oracle of Ages handles the two overworlds gimmick better than A Link to the Past, because the two eras feel a lot more intertwined here. That's to be expected, since they're the same overworld 400 years apart, but still. It's really cool seeing how much Labrynna changes in that time, especially since some of the things you can do in the past may take effect in the present. Come to think of it, why wasn't the subtitle A Link to the Past save for this game? I mean, Link actually goes to the past in this game. With this design philosophy, it's evidently clear that Ages is built around puzzle solving, as opposed to the more combat-focused Oracle of Seasons. This philosophy extends to the dungeons, which are much better than those found in Seasons. The puzzles in this game are really creative and fun, utilizing various unique mechanics such as colored barriers and minecarts, as well as various items like the seed shooter and switch hook. All these mechanics blend really well together, making each puzzle really engaging. The combat might be a little weaker than it was in Seasons, but it's still pretty fun. Back to the overworld, Labrina is so much more lively than Holodrum. The more varied population, memorable set pieces, and interesting lore make this world far more engaging to explore. Since I played this game after Seasons, I was able to link my save file up with that game, unlocking some extra bonuses. You start out with a pre-equipped sword and an extra heart container. There are more goodies to find, some of the stuff you did in the other game is carried over or acknowledged here, Zelda herself shows up, and there's also an extra dungeon with the true final bosses. Okay, that last one is a little ham-fisted, sure, but the rest are more than welcome additions. Anyway, while Seasons is still good, Ages is easily my preferred Oracle game thanks to its fun gameplay and more immersive world. I still recommend both games, preferably if you link up the second one you play, but there's nothing stopping you from enjoying them each on their own. Also, because I know that some people will yell at me for this, the reason I gave the Oracle games a pass for something I blasted Fire Emblem Fates for is simple. The Oracle games are two separate games you're given the option to link up, while FE Fates advertised itself as a branching narrative kind of game, only to require you to buy each route separately. There's a big difference.
I like trains.
Looks like all the criticism I leveled against Phantom Hourglass paid off, because 2 years later, its dev team brought us Spirit Tracks, which is actually a really good game. Yeah, I know these games came out around 15 years ago, but shut up, let me be unfunny. Rather than trying and failing to be a portable expansion of Wind Waker, Spirit Tracks opts to go its own way while still carrying over many aspects of its predecessor. This, of course, means that the touch controls are back, but don't worry, they're much more responsive in this game, at least for the most part. This could be because I already got used to Phantom Hourglass's controls, but Spirit Tracks still feels much better to play. For instance, rather than drawing little circles to roll, you just have to double tap in a direction, which is far more intuitive. Unfortunately, this does not mean this game controls like a dream. This game makes you blow into the microphone a lot to use some of the new items, including the Spirit Flute. The flute duets in particular are so goddamn janky and annoying, and I'd be surprised if they were playtested at all. Part of the annoyance could have come from the fact that I had to use the Wii U gamepad vertically, but still. Thankfully, outside the god-awful microphone controls, this game is a blast. Gone is the shallow Great Sea stand-in, and in its place is Train. Controlling the speed and direction the Spirit Train goes makes me feel so much more involved than drawing a path and waiting to arrive. This game's overworld is so much more interactive than Phantom Hourglass's, and even something as simple as adding another track feels rewarding. It helps that the overworld theme is beautiful, as is the rest of the soundtrack. It's like the composers noticed how bland the soundtrack of Phantom Hourglass was, and decided to put a lot more effort into that at this game. Back to the gameplay, the dungeons are another highlight. Each one uses the game's items and mechanics that don't involve the microphone very well. It even has a multi-segment dungeon that you visit several times throughout the game that doesn't suck. Reason number 1, there's no time limit. Reason number 2, you aren't forced to repeat floors you've already done. And reason number 3, you get to control both Link and Zelda. Finally, a Zelda game where you play as Zelda. Taking advantage of both of their abilities to get through each floor of the Spirit Tower is challenging yet engaging, making me anticipate each visit. Also, about Zelda herself, because she got Alphonse Elric, she is your main companion in this game. As such, she gets more screen time than just about any other incarnation, and she's so much more charming, dynamic, and fleshed out as a result. Honestly, she might just be my favorite iteration of the character to date. Not to mention, this game is a comedic riot. There are so many parts of this game that have given me a laugh, to the point where this game could be considered the funniest Zelda game. Memos are back and better than ever, the locations you go to are all enticing, Linebeck is back, and overall, Spirit Tracks is just everything Phantom Hourglass should have been. It's a shame it never got re-released with the option for button controls, because this is a damn underrated installment in the series.
He ruined my dream journal!
The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening was the first game in the series to release on a handheld, and also the first to not take place in Hyrule. To compensate for the limited power of the Game Boy, Link's Awakening has a much smaller scope than the rest of the series at the time. Koholint Island is anything but Hyrule. Not only are its set pieces much smaller, but it also lacks numerous elements we've come to expect from the series, like the Triforce, the Master Sword, and even Zelda herself. In their place is a much more wacky and whimsical world and cast of characters than what we're used to. For this reason, this game is a lot more bizarre far than the rest of the series, and it helps that the writing is a lot more comedic and offbeat this time around. Coupled with the simple premise of just having to get off the island, this was probably the best route they could have taken with the Game Boy's limited power. In terms of gameplay, Link's Awakening is structured somewhat like A Link to the Past, albeit noticeably downscaled to fit onto the Game Boy. Honestly, they did a great job at translating that gameplay style over to the smaller screen. Roaming around the island, fighting enemies, solving puzzles, finding secrets, and storming dungeons remains as fun as ever. If you ask me, the only real drawback that came with being on the Game Boy was its lack of buttons. Since you only have 2 item slots, one of which you'll usually save for your sword, you have to open the menu to switch items a lot, which can kind of slow down the game's pace. It can also be a little cryptic to know where to go in the overworld, or what to do in a dungeon. I know that some of these issues were fixed in the Switch remake, but come on. Anyway, Koholint seems like a nice place on the surface, but it sadly isn't all sunshine and rainbows. Yeah, I'm about to drop spoilers for a 30-year-old game. Skip to this time frame if you care that much. Anyway, in order to leave the island, Link must wake up the Windfish. Over the course of the game, however, the dungeon's bosses warn you that if you proceed on your quest, the island will vanish. At first, it sounds like they're just playing tricks on you, but eventually, you learn the dark truth of the island. It's all an illusion formed by a dream from the Windfish, and should it wake, the dream will end and the island will vanish. That is a very shocking twist. In a series where you're normally the hero of legend, your actions are put into question as to whether they're right or not. There's a good chance you've gotten really attached to Koholint and its residents, so knowing that your quest will ultimately end with its downfall is just painful. I usually don't like the "it was all a dream" ending, but this is one of the few times where I find it to be really effective. You woke up the Windfish, but at what cost? Was it right to wipe an island from existence just to go home? Was the island even real to begin with? Can you call yourself a hero? Anyway, for the series' first outing on a handheld system, Link's Awakening knocked it out of the park. While it has aged poorly in some areas, it did a great job at translating the series formula over to the Game Boy. If you want to check it out, the remake is available on the Switch. Or if you're broke like me, you could just play the Game Boy Color version. That works too. If you're a fan of this series, you've probably heard plenty about the Zelda cycle, where a game is wildly hated upon release, only to gain more praise over time and eventually be considered one of the best games in the series. This actually happens with a lot of series, but it's quite infamous with Zelda, with the Wind Waker on the GameCube being arguably the worst offender. Apparently, when this game came out, people hated it. They didn't like how cartoony it looked and felt compared to Ocarina and Majora, especially after having seen that much grittier tech demo. Over time, people gave this game more chances and realized, this game isn't actually half bad. Thank Hylia they did, because the Wind Waker is amazing. Let's get the elephant in the room out of the way first. The art style. It looks far more cartoony than what the series was known for at the time, but you know what? I love it. In an age where so many games tried to look as cutting edge and realistic as possible, only to age poorly graphically, I'm so glad this game opted to favor strong art direction over graphical fidelity. Not that realistic graphics can age well, since Metroid Prime came out the same year and it still looks gorgeous. Wind Waker's art style gives the game so much charm, from its cell shading, to its character design, to its animations. It all looked great in 2002, and it still looks great today. I can't picture this game without this art style, especially since the GameCube probably wouldn't render the Great Sea if it looked like the water in Mario Sunshine. On the topic of the Great Sea, it's, dare I say it, great. I was worried it was just gonna be bland, empty space like the sky in Skyward Sword, but I was proven wrong. In between the main locales, there are so many goodies to find and small islands to discover. Sailing to your next destination can be just as fun as the destinations themselves, thanks to all the enemies, treasures, and other surprises along the way. It's a little big, sure, but the Swift Sail and the Wii U remaster makes sailing a breeze. My heart goes out to all the GameCube veterans who had to change the wind direction every minute. The main locales you visit on your quest are just as fun as the sea. Aside from the Forsaken Fortress, which is extremely boring and tedious, all the landmarks are exciting, and all the dungeons make expert use of their themes and mechanics. The experience of going to each island, figuring out what to do, and slaying every enemy on sight is great, as is the lore, the music, the side quests, the numerous shocking plot twists, Tetra, the King, Ganondorf, the Triforce quest. Okay, maybe not that one, but that's besides the point. I love the Wind Waker, and I deeply wish Nintendo would port it over to the Switch. It needs to shine on an actually successful system for once, because it deserves to be played by as many people as possible.
It's Crazy Hat Day, Crazy Hat Day.
Whoa, you guys were not kidding about the Minish Cap. I went into this game expecting another basic yet fun adventure like the Oracle games, but it is so much more than that. The Minish Cap might just be the most underrated entry in the series to date. It's built on a lot of the foundations of previous top-down entries, but with one major twist. With the aid of Best Hat, Eslo, Link can shrink down to a minuscule size. This helps you explore in new, creative ways, which more than makes up for this overworld feeling slightly smaller than others. Not only does this help you get past areas you wouldn't be able to otherwise, but it can also provide new perspectives in the world. The oversized, detailed environments and visual effects really make you feel small. The game's presentation in general is outstanding. The vibrant colors, clean sprite work, and bouncy animations all make excellent use of the Game Boy Advance's hardware, and they add so much more life to this game's various areas than they already had. It honestly might be the best looking 2D Zelda game, which is fitting since it was the last mainline entry to prioritize 2D sprites. Obviously, graphics alone are not enough to carry a game, but this game is thankfully just as fun mechanically as it is visually. The overworld makes great use of this game's mechanics, especially in the areas leading up to dungeons. Figuring out how to get across each area, either small or regular sized, is really engaging. It helps that the dungeons themselves are also a blast. With one exception, this might be the best selection of 2D dungeons of the series. They're all vastly unique from one another with their own mechanics, aesthetics, and routes. Each of the items you find in the dungeons are used brilliantly both inside and outside of them, enhancing the exploration and puzzle solving a ton. The bosses are also very creative and fun, with each one making great use of their mechanics. On the topic of combat, you can learn various skills from swordmasters, which can help a ton during fights. Also, by finding kinstone pieces and taking them to NPCs with their other halves, you can have extra chests appear in the overworld, which is a great way to encourage more exploration. I'm running short on things to say, so just know that The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap is criminally underrated and one of the best games the Game Boy Advance has to offer. Just for the love of Hylia, don't do the gacha side quest. I actually had no idea it even existed when I played this game, and that might have been for the better. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past was the game that set the standard for all future entries to follow. I thought it was alright on my first playthrough, but I didn't really get the hype with it until I replayed it a few years later, after having played the first two games. After Zelda 1 and especially Zelda 2, it feels like A Link to the Past is where the series really found its footing. So many series staples got their start here, from Zelda's Lullaby to the Master Sword. Even the series' typical structure of a few dungeons, then a big story event, then more dungeons, then the endgame got its start here. The overworld is far more lively than anything that could be done on the NES. Many NPCs and landmarks are seamlessly placed onto the main overworld rather than in sub-areas. The environments are more varied, the dungeons have unique themes, the enemies and bosses have more varied designs and attack patterns. Many of this is thanks to the power of the SNES, which this game also showcases beautifully from a graphical standpoint. The sprites are clean, the colors pop, the UI is intuitive, there are so many neat visual effects, I could go on. For an early SNES game, it's as good of a showcase for the hardware as you could get. Like Super Mario World, I love you, you're one of my favorite games ever, but my god is your sprite work inconsistent. Here, it blends together seamlessly, and it still looks great today. Wanna know what else is great about this game? The soundtrack. So many iconic tracks made their debut in this game, and the better sound chip enhances their grand feeling. It's not the best soundtrack on the SNES, but it's definitely up there. Back to the overworld, because it's so lively, it's so much more fun to explore. The more varied set pieces and introduction of a proper map screen help you figure out where you are and what to do exponentially. For instance, instead of blending in with the walls around them, bombable walls now appear cracked, indicating that they can be destroyed. Grass and pots can be cut now, yielding some extra hearts and rupees. Most importantly, this game's controls are a massive step up from the NES games. Instead of stabbing, Link now swings his sword, making it much easier to hit enemies. This game also introduces Link's now iconic spin attack, helping you cut down hordes of enemies and grass at once. Also, instead of only 4 directions, you can move diagonally! There's a wide variety of items you can find on your journey, from the traditional to the mystic. They're all a blast to use, and it's no wonder that some of them, such as the hookshot, became series mainstays. Also, does one overworld seem like not enough for you? Well, you're in luck, because for the first time in the series, there's a second overworld in the form of the Dark World. This place serves as a great parallel to the Light World, and it's really fun switching between the two worlds to reach new places. The dungeons are not only large in number, but they're a huge leap forward in terms of design. Rather than walking around, fighting enemies, and finding keys, there are so many more varied puzzles, gizmos, and routes. This game experiments with so many different kinds of dungeon design to make each one stand out. Granted, not all the dungeons are winners. The Desert Palace is a bit annoying, annoying, and the Ice Palace can burn in the fires of hell for all I care, but the ones that work really work, and this kind of experimentation would go on to influence the rest of the series going forward, just like the overworlds, the combat, the lore, etc. Simply put, the Zelda series would not be nearly as great as it is today without A Link to the Past. This game sets so many foundations that the series still follows to this day, on top of being visually polished and a blast to play.
All of this just works.
The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was not my first ever Zelda game, but the massive hype surrounding it upon release was what sparked my initial interest in the series. While I didn't play the game until around 10 months after its release, I spent hours watching so many videos on Breath of the Wild, which acted as my gateway to the legendary realm of Hyrule. Once I finally got my hands on a copy of this game for the Switch, I was instantly hooked. Now that the life story is over, let's start talking about the actual game. After waking up in the Shrine of Resurrection, you will set foot in a massive depiction of Hyrule. This is where it hits you. This game is a full-fledged open world game. 99% of the time, if you see something, you can go to it, no matter how far away it may seem. You're no longer bound by walls and load zones. Nearly every wall can be climbed over, and the entire map is seamlessly connected. Previous games weren't exactly linear, since each area had a bunch of optional goodies and side quests, but you were still required to do certain things in a certain order to progress. Breath of the Wild throws any trace of linearity out the window. To be fair, the game does restrict you to the Great Plateau for the first hour or so to show you the ropes, but it does a great job at teaching you how to play the game. And once you finally get off, this game really opens up. Seriously, you could just go straight to the final boss at that point if you really want to. Personally, I highly advise against doing that, unless you're a speedrunner, because even the most basic enemies can be threatening early on thanks to your low stats and weak weapons. You're encouraged to explore the world, completing shrines, killing enemies, and obtaining more weapons to get stronger. Also, on the topic of weapons, they break now. This is one aspect of this game a lot of people dislike, and personally, I'm a little split on it. On one hand, it does a great job at making you carefully manage resources, since you can only use that one super strong weapon so many times before it shatters. On the other hand, it often feels like they break too quickly, and it doesn't help that you can't see how much longer you can use them until they're just about to break. If they lasted a little longer, or if they added a bar showing a weapon's remaining durability like what Minecraft has, that would be great. Hyrule is bigger than ever in this game. Exploring its vast regions and landmarks, be they new or familiar, is immensely engaging and breathtaking. It's well worth it, not just for the shrines and goodies, but also for the sheer euphoria. Monolith Soft had already done stellar world design within the Xenoblade series, and it translates over to Zelda brilliantly. Exploration isn't strictly limited to the overworld, as this game also has a plethora of shrines. Assuming they aren't just rewards, tests of strength, or constellation BS, they provide some great puzzles involving the 4 Sheikah runes. They act as a good substitute for mini dungeons, much better than the Divine Beasts for the main dungeons. Gonna be honest, this is another area where this game kinda stumbles. I don't think the Divine Beasts are bad. I enjoy the events leading up to them, and moving around parts of the beast with the Sheikah slate can be fun, but they all feel like the same find the 5 switches scenario with an uninspired boss fight at the end, and you can't even go back to them once you finish them. It's a shame most of the main boss is underwhelmed, because this game's core combat is actually really solid. Landing hits still feels intuitive and satisfying, and the introduction of the Flurry Rush adds a great risk-reward factor. By exploring the world, you'll get more stuff, get a better feel of the land, and get more accustomed to the controls. As you explore, you'll get stronger and better at the game, so it's best to explore as much as you can before tackling the main story missions. While my opinion on Breath of the Wild has soured a little bit over time due to the lackluster dungeons, unpolished storytelling, annoying load times, and occasional wasted space, I still love it for how massive yet cohesive it is. Exploring is a blast, the music is beautifully atmospheric, the lore runs deep to the point where it's generated countless analysis videos, and all in all, Breath of the Wild is a brilliant step forward for the series, and its massive success can still be felt today. And yet, it didn't even crack the top 5. Buckle up, because the remaining 5 are some of my favorite games ever.
That's really only applicable on Flounder because this game doesn't like cannibal walls.
And the award for the best 2D Zelda game goes to... A Link Between Worlds! A direct sequel to a classic game that released over 2 decades prior is not very common, let alone one that builds upon every foundation of the original and outdoes it in nearly every way. Even so, A Link Between Worlds pulls all the stops to make it the peak of this series' top-down outings. Let's start with the controls. Since we're back to button controls, and because the 3DS has a circle pad, Link's 8-direction movement has been upgraded to analog movement. As a result, movement feels godlike in this game, and it helps that swinging your sword and using using items feels much more quick and snappy than before. With controls this tight, the gameplay maintains a smooth, brisk pace throughout. A Link Between Worlds is a lot more than just a new Link to the Past, as thanks to the power of a magic bracelet and the 3DS, you can now merge into and walk through walls. This opens up so many ways to get around, both in the overworld and the dungeons, and the puzzles that use it are simply genius. Even though the main overworld is mostly reused from A Link to the Past, the wall merging, among other things, manages to make exploring this old world still feel fresh. The Dark World is absent this time around, and in its place is the parallel kingdom of Lorule. When you first arrive there, you're given the option of which order you'd like to tackle the dungeons in. For the first time in a long time, this game at this point lets you explore your own will instead of forcing you to do the dungeons in a specified order. There's no need to worry about having to get certain items from certain dungeons first, because this time, items can be rented from Ravio. This is great for giving each item a chance in the spotlight, and it helps that entire dungeons are designed around these items rather than mere portions of them. The dungeons themselves are stellar. They retain everything that made A Link to the Past dungeons great, and the extra power of the 3DS gives them some extra flair and a much greater sense of scale. There's almost never a dull moment to be found within this game's dungeons, and I always have a blast mowing down enemies and figuring out what to do to proceed. And the music is great, the art direction is great, the lore is great, the mini games are great. You get it? This game does pretty much everything right. The only slight grievance I have with this game is its low difficulty. Aside from maybe Skyward Sword, this is undoubtedly the easiest game in the series. Even with that one complaint, The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds is phenomenal. It is the most polished 2D Zelda game to date, and it remains just as fun an entire decade later. The crown jewel of the 3DS, without question.
Hey, is that the werewolf from Twilight?
Even after all the times the typical Zelda structure has been used, I don't think there's a single entry that pulled it off with more polish than Twilight Princess. Though it is built off the foundations of many other Zelda games, such as Ocarina of Time, it introduces and polishes so much that it still manages to feel distinct from the rest of the series. The overworld feels so tightly knit together, and each area manages to leave a lasting impression, from the humble Ordona province to the sparkling Lake Hylia and the vast Gerudo Desert. Even Hyrule Field, which is normally completely barren in the 3D games, is split up into multiple sectors spread across the map, akin to one of the 2D games. Granted, it's still a little empty, but I'll take it any day over one big wasteland. Once you first arrive in an area, however, it will be covered in Twilight. Not only do these segments help you get used to the area, but they also really show how much damage the Twilight Realm has done to Hyrule. Before that, the game had a really humble start in Ordon Village. It was a little long, sure, but it did a great job at setting up the journey ahead. The big shift in tone when the kids get taken and Link first becomes a wolf is very impactful, and I was super determined to get them back. While this is a great personal motivation for Link, and there are some outstanding scenes later on that develop his bond with the kids, that's not the story's strongest aspect. That is, of course, Link's companion, Midna. When you first meet her, Midna doesn't give the slightest damn about you or Hyrule, seeing you as little more than a tool for her to reclaim her throne. Over the course of the game, however, she grows more attached to you and the world, and she becomes a better person because of it. She learns that to be a respected ruler, you must look out for your people and come to their aid in times of need. She's easily the best companion in the series, thanks to how three-dimensional and well-developed she is. Now we move on to the dungeons. If you're a dungeon lover, Twilight Princess is the game for you, because it might just have the best lineup of dungeons the series has to offer. All the dungeons in this game, even the worst ones, are very well thought out, both in terms of presentation and gameplay. There's not a single one that didn't somehow leave me in awe. Paired with so many excellent items like the Gale Boomerang, Spinner, and double claw shots, they all make brilliant uses of this game's mechanics. You know what else is really fun? The combat. Your moveset starts off rather simple, but over time you learn more moves from totally not Ocarina of Time Link that really spice things up. Performing stylish new moves to take down a wide variety of enemies is super fun, and an excellent evolution of the combat in Wind Waker. Even the wolf form is surprisingly fun to use, as you can run and attack faster, and the Twilight Realm segments are very much designed with it in mind. Let's take a bit of a step back and talk about the aesthetics. I know people like to rag on this game's art style for trying too hard to look realistic, but honestly, I love it. The serene, picturesque look of Hyrule honestly holds up pretty well to this day, and the Twilight Realm manages to look eerie yet eye-catching with only a few colors. Also, I'm just gonna come right out and say it. Twilight Princess has the single best soundtrack out of any Zelda game. Every single piece is synonymous with their respective scenarios, be they for the fields, the battles, the dungeons, and all of it perfectly sells the atmosphere. Between its engaging story, exhilarating dungeons, and outstanding presentation, Twilight Princess manages to keep me on the edge of my seat the whole way through. Granted, it's not complete perfection. The tutorial's a little long, there are a handful of rage-inducing segments, and Ganondorf kind of hijacks the plot towards the end. A shame too, because the rest of that finale is fantastic. Even with those issues, Twilight Princess is an absolutely incredible experience from start to finish, and I can't possibly think of a better note for the GameCube to go out on.
I am a master builder.
Ever since it was first revealed in 2019, Tears of the Kingdom had been at the top of my most anticipated games list, aside from the brief period in 2022 leading up to Xenoblade 3. I spent 4 years waiting for this game to come out, and that long wait was well worth it. Let's start with everyone's biggest fear going into this game, the reuse of Breath of the Wild's map. I'll be honest, I was a little skeptical too. Having most of the trailers take place in the old map and above it made this new game look more like DLC. But then the game came out, and I was proven wrong. As amazing as Breath of the Wild was, Tears of the Kingdom honestly makes that game look like an alpha build in comparison. While the surface overworld may be reused from the previous game, much like A Link Between Worlds, this game adds so much stuff to it that it's still a lot of fun to traverse. It feels a lot like you're returning to an old favorite city after a few years and seeing how much has changed. Gerudo Town now has a bunker, the Elden region has simmered down, allowing you to explore without the need of fire resistance, and there's now a half-assed fort in front of Castle Town. Yet there's still no town. You really expect me to believe that within the 6 or so years since the last game, they didn't even start rebuilding Castle Town? The big new addition to the surface in this game is caves. There are quite a few cave systems spread across Hyrule in this game, and they add quite a bit of depth to it. No pun intended. It's worth going around the surface looking for these caves since they may contain goodies or even shrines. The surface isn't the only place you can explore in this game, because there are 2 new maps above and below it. The one that hogged the spotlight in the marketing is the sky. There are now numerous islands floating above Hyrule, which are very fun to go through for each of their rewards. Not to mention, looking down on Hyrule atop the sky islands is breathtaking, and traveling between the earth and sky is impressively seamless. The other map that Nintendo kept mostly a secret is the Depths, a dark, dangerous realm beneath Hyrule. It'll take a lot of skill, perseverance, and bright bloom seeds to survive down here, but it's well worth it for how much valuable loot you can find. To help traverse these new lands, Link has access to new abilities. There's Ascend, which is really useful for leaving caves and climbing mountains, as well as Recall, which can send objects back in time and help you cheese shrines. Be honest, you did it too. Then there's Fuse, which lets you fuse items with your weapons. This opens up so many different methods of combat. You can focus on adding extra damage, applying status effects, or whatever other unique property of the thing you decide to fuse your stuff with. Paired with the already solid battle mechanics returning from Breath of the Wild, the amount of options you have to fight enemies makes the combat in Tears of the Kingdom easily the best in the series. And last but not least, we have Ultra Hand, which lets you use Zonai devices and other things to build various contraptions, such as vehicles. Not only is this extremely useful for getting around, but it can really open your creative lens. It's a little janky, but experimenting with different kinds of builds is a ton of fun, especially as you gather more devices from the sky and Zonite from the depths. While Breath of the Wild might be more fun to explore in, Tears of the Kingdom is definitely more fun to mess around in. It's honestly more of a 3D Terraria than Minecraft will ever be. That's not to say this game doesn't have a strong main quest, because it more than delivers in that department. To start, the dungeons are actual dungeons now. While I was initially disappointed to see the return of the 5 or so switches formula from the previous game, I got over it soon enough because this game handles it much better. The designs of each dungeon are much more varied, and they all have a good amount of well-designed puzzles to help each one stand out, except for the Wind Temple, which is a little too basic for my taste. I especially love the Fire Temple with how it plays around with minecarts and really makes you think of how to arrange the rails. Unless you just cheese it, feel free to do that. The new champions, now sages, are given much more time to shine, and they really feel like they're part of a team with Link. I had a lot of fun playing around with each of their abilities when they actually decided to cooperate. Even a lot of the side characters feel much more involved with the story, world, and certain side quests. Not to mention, the bosses, not you, are spectacular. The story is much more engaging. Ganondorf might be the most menacing he's ever been in the series before, and the final act goes so insanely hard that it might just be the best in the series. A game of this caliber shouldn't be possible today, where every single thing is cranked up to the max. Even so, Tears of the Kingdom pulls all the stuff stops it possibly can to make it one of the best and most impactful games of the decade so far. As you can probably tell, this is my game of the year. As excellent as the likes of Pizza Tower, Final Fantasy XVI, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder are, they all pale in comparison to The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. When I was 12 years old, I knew almost nothing about The Legend of Zelda. When I went to a friend's house at that time, I asked if I could try his 3DS, and I played a little bit of a certain game, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. This convinced me to get the game on my Wii U later that year, and I even made a Let's Play out of my first playthrough. My life has never been the same since. I owe a lot to this game, as it's helped me grow into the person I am today. Let's cut my life story short for now, because there has to be some reason as to why this is the highest rated game of all time. The beginning of Ocarina of Time is much more whimsical and childlike than the rest of the series. Even despite the numerous dangers present within Hyrule, there's a charming sense of innocence throughout the first leg of your adventure. You are a child at this point, so it makes sense that you'd see the world in a primarily positive light. Most of the people you meet at this point are relatively simple yet friendly people. The locations you visit are full of charm and wonder, and they're mostly fun to explore. Even the first few dungeons are much more simplistic than others in the series, yet they still work very well for selling the early atmosphere and teaching you how the game works. The puzzles here are simple yet satisfying, and the revamped combat really shines. Thanks to the extra access to the N64, you can now lock on to specific enemies in battle, making attacking and dodging much more intuitive. Even the basic premise seems simple at first. Ganondorf is threatening Hyrule, so get the 3 spiritual stones and get the Triforce before he does. However, once you get the Master Sword and open the Sacred Realm, you are frozen in time for 7 years, allowing Ganondorf to seize the Triforce. Once you wake up in the body of an adult, you will step into a desecrated version of the world you once called home. This is when it hits you. You and Zelda weren't playing around. Everything you did back then was for a cause. And because of one miscalculation on Zelda's part, you failed, and the world paid the price. The future world is nothing like what you saw as a child. It's much more ugly and dangerous than you could have possibly imagined in the past. So many people who were once happy are now suffering. The dungeons are no longer simple caves. They're now temples with branching paths and intricate puzzles. The training wheels are off, and the game really shows its dungeon design prowess going forth. Aside from the infamous water temple, every single future dungeon is atmospheric and fun, setting the standards for not just the series, but the medium of gaming as a whole. There are so many memorable rooms and puzzles, and the combat really shines thanks to the stronger enemies. It initially feels like all this scary stuff came out of the blue, but then you realize that it's always been there. The dungeons, the monsters, Ganondorf, it's all been around since you were young. You just didn't notice it because you were an innocent child who thought the world was peaceful. You are allowed to return to the past to relive memories and do certain quests, but with the knowledge you gain from growing up, is it really worth it? You've become aware of the dark truth of the world, and no amount of nostalgia trips through time can fix that. It all seems hopeless. Except it's not. You're still the hero of time. You still wield the Master Sword. You can still make things right. You can still defeat Ganondorf and restore this world's lost hope. No matter how dark everything may seem, there will always be a light at the end of the tunnel. There are many reasons as to why Ocarina of Time is such a classic. The dungeons are engaging. The combat is revolutionary. The bosses are marvelous. The soundtrack is iconic. The way the past and future intertwine is genius. And the fact that it laid so many foundations that we still see in video games made today. But I'd argue that it's the story and its seamless integration into the gameplay that makes this game so timeless. To be fair, there are some aspects of it that haven't aged too well, like Kaepora Gaebora and the empty Hyrule Field, but that does little to take away from this game's status as an all-time masterpiece, and it fills me with the same sense of wonder and sorrow every time I replay it. It more than deserves all the praise it's gotten over the past 25 years, and I see no better game than this to call Nintendo's magnum opus. And yet, it isn't number one. Despite all the praise I've given this game, there's one that I happen to like just a little bit more. There's a wide variety of video games that make up my favorites. There are games that captivated me with their engaging stories and powerful themes. There are games that sucked me into their worlds and got me really attached to their characters. And there are games that are, of course, really, really fun. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask is all 3 types rolled into one. For the longest time, I doubted this game. I thought there was no way it could be better than Ocarina and got confused as to how so many people called this their favorite. Then I finally played through the full game myself, and and suddenly, everything made sense. With only 1 year of dev time, Majora's Mask reuses a lot of assets from Ocarina of Time. Even so, the two games could not be more different from each other. While Ocarina is a slightly more typical adventure, Majora's Mask is an uncanny nightmare of an experience. You have 3 in-game days before the moon crashes into Termina and destroys everything. Sure, you could warp back to the start of the 3-day cycle, but that'll reset all the progress you made, save for a few important items. As a result, you feel trapped within the same nightmare playing over and over. You have to witness the world crumble and everyone in it suffer over and over again. Majora's Mask is an exceedingly dark game, but it never rubs in your face how dark it is. It lets you take in the dark tone yourself through its scenarios, dialogue, music, and general atmosphere. You feel truly immersed within Termina, and it helps that everything and everyone in this world feels alive. The side characters all have their own backstories, aspirations, and opinions on the current situation. Helping them feels rewarding, not just for the masks or heart pieces they give you, but also for the piece you've given them, brief as it may be. You really want to help all of them before the world ends, but you can only help so many people per cycle, because that's the harsh reality of being a hero. You can't always save everyone. The 3-day limit intertwines this story and gameplay so well that I can't see how it could possibly be done in a medium outside gaming. Because you only have 3 in-game days per cycle, you have to carefully strategize what to do at what time and execute it all in a timely manner. It may be frustrating, sure, but that just makes accomplishing tasks all the more satisfying. Besides, there are various tools to help you work around this, like the owl statues and Song of Time variations. The regions of Termina are unlike any other areas in the series. They're wildly different from each other in terms of presentation and design, yet they're all very engaging and fun to explore. The mask transformations add so many more movement options, opening up various new ways to play. While the dungeons may be few in number, they more than make up for it with how well they're designed and how satisfying they are to go through. There are so many side quests, minigames, and hidden areas that yield highly valuable rewards. The more you play this game, the more used to the routes and schedules you get, and the more stuff you can get done per cycle. Managing your time is the key to success in this game, and it's very satisfying to do as much as you can in one cycle. The fear and adrenaline generated by the time limit also contributes greatly to the game's flow, especially since you want everyone to make it out of this ordeal in one piece. It truly feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders, because once that moon hits, everyone you've met on your journey will die. You have to suffer the same nightmare as them over and over again, just for the slightest chance that they may see a new day. And once that new day finally dawns, all your effort is revealed to be well worth it. With the moon gone and the curses lifted, everyone is now free to live out their lives without the looming threat above them. Thanks to you, they made it through the deepest darkness and into the light. Because even in a world as dire as Termina, there's still hope. There's still light at the end of the tunnel. There's still a reason to keep going despite all the odds. On top of being a blast to play, Majora's Mask is so thematically powerful that it's impossible to play without at least feeling something. While it can admittedly be a bit annoying to play at times, and I'm well aware that it's not exactly a game for everyone, there's so much genius design presented and so many powerful emotions felt that any issue I may have with the game is easily forgiven. The existential dread, relatable characters, and tight world design pull me in so much that I kind of forget I'm playing a video game. It shouldn't be possible to immerse me in a fictional world this much, yet The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask still does so effortlessly. I see no better game to crown as not just my favorite Zelda game, but my favorite video game of all time. I don't think I will ever play another game that will leave a lasting impression like this.